morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night from wherever you are watching from. My name is Carlo Chokwas. Welcome to Street Accountants. So, in this lecture, we'll be talking about the our first section on the interactive Excel dashboard. As we all know, this is our Excel dashboard series. So, we'll be discussing about the data analysis and how to apply this concept in your day-to-day work activities. So this is a practical class and a very interactive section whereby for everything we'll be discussing, we'll be doing the practicals as soon as possible. So here we want to learn how to make meaning of these data sets that are here and present it in an authoritative way whereby the decision makers can actually see at a glance what is working and what is not working, who is making good sales, and where an improvement is needed. So here we'll be talking about the pivot table and the slicers. These are the two topics we'll be dealing with. So here, imagine that your organization or your management asks you questions based on this data set. Which state sold the most? Which product generated the highest sales? Which sales rep performed best? So if you look at this data set, you see that we have a lot of states, we have a lot of sales rep, and we have a lot of information. Manually adding the sales rep one by one or manually picking out the states one by one and adding it is a long process. And if you say you should want to use the sum ifs function, not everyone can actually write those formulas. That is where the pivot table comes in. So the pivot table helps you to make a good data analysis in a straightforward way, while the slicer helps in the interacting with the pivot table. So here we'll be answering this question as soon as possible. So the first question here is, which state sold the most? So using this our data set, we will now insert the pivot table so that we will start answering the questions that we have been asked. So how do we start this particular data analysis? First thing here, we need to insert the table by making this data set a table. Once you make it a table, you can be able to answer other questions. So what do? You simply make sure that your cursor is in any of the data sets here. Once it is there, you now do what we call Control T. If you put Control T, a box pops up here and tells you that this is a table that you want to create. Then it now asks you, my table has headers, make sure that this is tick. So you click OK. So this transforms your data set into a table and gives you a beautiful, meaningful color. And you can also change the color using this particular area at the top here to choose any color of your choice. So having done that, you can now continue. So we have converted it to a table by using the Control T, or you can even go to Insert here and insert the table if you want, or you just use the Control key. The second part is to insert the pivot table. So how do you insert the pivot table? You simply come up to this your menu and click on Insert. Once you click on Insert, you see the pivot table staring at you by this side. You click on the pivot table. When you click on the pivot table, normally by default, Excel always chooses to open the pivot table on a new sheet. So Excel will now ask you, choose where you want the pivot table to be placed. And I like that new worksheet so that it will not come and cluster in this particular table. So I will leave it at this new worksheet and just click OK. So Excel takes me to a new sheet and name it sheet 1. So this is the pivot table area by the left, while this particular place is the pivot table fields. So this field identifies all those headings I have in my data set at the beginning. So having done that, the next thing is for me to start working on this pivot table. So before then, you watch that this pivot table has filter, columns, rows, and values. So these are the things that we use and do and set up our pivot table. So remember, we want to answer the first question, which state sold the most. So in this particular place, we will drag the state and drag the cells. So that is how we will do it. So first of all, we pick this state here and we drag this cell state to this row. So you hold your left key and drag the state to this place. Then you come to the sales amount because you want to know the amount they sold. So if you watch on the left hand side, it has already inserted all the states available. Then you come here, you left click and drag the cells and drop it at the values. So it adds the second one, which is the values. So your pivot table is making sense now. So the next thing for you to do is for you to watch this, and you can actually come here, touch on any of the amounts, then right click and you sort. Click on the sort, use largest to smallest, then it automatically sorts it for you and tells you that Lagos sold the highest amount. So we have answered the first question, which state sold the most. Pivot table makes this easier for you to answer. The same way, you can decide to remove the state and replace it with the product and put the product on the row. The same thing, you can still right click on this amount and sort highest to lowest, and it shows you the product that made the highest sales and so on and so forth. The same way, you can still remove the product by coming to this right and unchecking it and drag the sales rep and put on this place. Then after then, you come here, touch on any of the figure, you right click and you use sort largest to smallest. It tells you that Aisha is the sales rep that sold the most. So if you see, we have already answered which product generated the highest sales and which product performed best as fast as possible. So in the States, we answered Lagos. This one was rice, while this one is Aisha. So you see what the pivot table has helped us do. If we were to start working on this data, it will take us a lot of time to drive the product that made the highest, or to drive the sales rep, or to get the states, because we need to be writing formulas up and down. But this pivot table takes all the information and add it for you and show you at a glance. So I can decide to go back and uncheck this and draw back my state the way it is. So now, having done this, you can decide to beautify this your table if you like beautification. All you need to do, make sure that your cursor is placed on any of the values in this pivot table. Then go up to your design. A design comes in, you can keep on this drop down, then select the table you want to use. Some people love beautiful tables, so you can actually select based on the particular colors that you choose. This time around is based on your preference. You have the opportunity of selecting any of the colors that you want or that you admire. So these are just to make your work look beautiful and edifying. I can decide to choose this color. Then I can decide to highlight and increase the font size maybe to 12. So you can choose any color you want for your table. And me, I'll just choose this one for the teaching purposes. So after you have done this, you have already learned how to insert the pivot table and work with the pivot table. So as you can see, the pivot table is something easy and very sweet to use. So now, let me go back to this my data set and make some changes. Let me change this river state. Let me just call it OB state, just OB like this. Then let me change this Imo state. Let me just call it AN. Sorry, let me just call it AP. So I made two changes. I added new states, OB state and AP state. Let's go back to my pivot table and see what will happen. So if I come to my pivot table, you will notice that the state did not change. The state on this pivot table did not change. So I still have the normal states. So what do I need to do so that this OB and the new changes I made will reflect on this pivot table? I simply need to click on the pivot table, right click, then I will search for refresh, which is this. So I will click refresh. So once I refresh the pivot table, you notice that the AP and the OB has now been refreshed and added to my pivot table as a new data. So this is how you add informations in your original sheet, then you come here to refresh so that it will be connected to your pivot table, or it will be linked. So let me just remove it and go back to how it is at the beginning. So let me just come here and change here to the normal state that we are. Then, so now having this, so any changes I make on the initial data set will automatically reflect on this pivot table, but I will need to come here and click on the refresh, right click and click on the refresh. So that is that about the pivot table. So this ends our discussion on the pivot table. So the next discussion we'll be having is on the slicers and how to make use of the slicers. So using the same information as we just concluded the pivot table on, I will continue the slicers using that same information. So now we want to insert the slicer and make the slicer to interact with this our pivot table. So what do I need to do to insert the slicer? So if you can notice, once you click outside, this pivot table here goes back out. If you click on the table, it comes back. So how do I insert the slicer? I will just click on the pivot table. Once I click on the pivot table, I will go up here and you will see the pivot table analyzer. I will click on the pivot table analyzer up here. Then you will see insert slicer. I will just click on the insert slicer. So if I click on this insert slicer, I can either insert for the state, for the sales rep, because each slicer, you can insert as many slicers as possible. So if you want to insert the slicer for state, for sales rep, I can just check this sales rep and click OK. The slicer for sales rep appear and I can move it around. But if I don't want to insert through this method, I can decide to remove this slicer and use another way to insert the same slicer again for sales rep. All I need to do is to come to this my pivot tables field. On this sales rep, I will right click on this sales rep only and add slicer. The same pattern, it will still come out. So it's either you use this one up here, this table analyzer here, which is this one, and check, maybe check product like this. If you click OK, it will come out. If you don't want to use it, you come to this product, you right click and do add slicer, so it will come out. So let me remove them and then show you back how I did it. So let me remove the two slicers and now go back. So let me use this particular method here on the right. So I will come to the sales rep on the right and right click on the sales rep and click on add slicer. So once I add slicer, so I can actually adjust it by moving it, by shifting the space, maybe doing it the way I want. If I want to readjust it, I can shift it, I can move it around, I can put it just here. So watch what happens. Let me increase the font size for this one to 16 so that everybody can see it clearly. So watch what happens when I work with the slicer. So now in this slicer, if I click on Aisha, notice that the slicer changes. So it notice that the pivot table changes. Told me that Aisha only sold at Lagos, Kaduna, Ogun, and Imo. If I click on Chinedu, it changes. Chinedu sold in Enugu, Anambra, Kaduna, and Imo, and it made a total of this. If I click on Emeka, it tells me that Emeka sold only on Abuja and Nasarawa State with a grand total of this. The same thing with Grace, the same thing with Ibrahim, the same thing with Peter. It tells me the states that these salespeople performed and where they made their sales. If I want to uncheck and go back to my complete table, I will just come at the right top here of this slicer and click on this funnel, and it will clear the filter. It will go back to this. So let me just leave this one here. Let me insert another slicer. I will come to this pivot table and click anywhere. The pivot table field comes out. Let me say I want to check the products now. I will now right click on the product and add slicer for the product. The product slicer comes out. So now I want to know how the beverages did. So if I click on the beverages up here to tell me that beverages was only sold in Anambra and it was only sold by Chinedu. The same thing if I click on the detergent, it tells me that it's only Emeka that sold detergent and he sold it at Abuja for 33. Then if I click on milk, so it will tell me that Grace, Port Harcourt, noodles, Aisha sold noodles at Ogun and Imo. Oil, Aisha sold oil in Lagos. Rice, Aisha and Chinedu sold rice in these states. Soap, Ibrahim sold soap in Kaduna. Sugar. So it will tell us the details as we move. So you can actually decide to push this sales rep up, then bring this one down. Then on this product, you clear this filter so that the pivot table returns to normal. When you clear it, the pivot table returns to normal. So you see this pivot table are interacting with these slicers are interacting with this pivot table. And these slicers, you can actually change the color if you want by clicking on the slicer, then go to slicer, then you pick any color that you want to use for the slicer. You see the slicer changes. That is if you want to change the color. If you don't want, you can leave it the way it is. There is no strict rule to changing the colors. So after you have done this slicer and you have seen that it is interacting with this table, then you can decide to add a graph. So if you want to add a graph to this your design, for this your report, to make it more interactive, you click on the pivot table, then you go to that same pivot analyzer. You want to add a chart, so you click on pivot analyzer. The pivot analyzer, if you go to the right, you will see pivot chart. So you click on the pivot chart. So you select the chart based on the one you want. There are so many charts here. Let me just pick this one for educational purposes. I click OK. So it comes out. So when it comes out, I can actually shift this my slicers and just to rearrange this a little bit, move this up. Then I can decide to maybe shift it a little, I can shift my slicers, then I can push this one beside this table. Then I can actually decide to put the slicers just beside this graph and this way. The choice is yours. There is no strict rule to this. So I can now decide also to change the color of this my graph by coming to this end here that has something like a brush and click on it. You will see different style. Then I can change the color by picking any color of my choice. I can decide to pick this color. I can decide to pick any color, and so on and so forth. So there's many colors, and you can go down and choose more colors. So after I have done that, I can decide to use this color. So, and you can stay resize and make it bigger if you want. So you can decide to shift this one, then shift this one a little. All of them are draggable. You can decide to make your charts more bigger for visibility. So now you have all these data sets here arranged in this place, ready to do your analysis and ready to report to the management. Maybe they give you 10 minutes to make use and make meaning of this large data set that are in millions. Using the pivot table, you can be able to organize them, and from here you can actually take decisions. So for any question that anyone can ask you on this data set here, this pivot table and the slicer can answer it. So the same way, so right now if you click on Aisha at the top, you see that so many things changes. The pivot table changes and the chart also changes. You have Lagos, Kaduna, Ogun, and Imo, the same thing you have for the chart. So for anything you click on the slicers, it interacts with this chart and the pivot table. So if you click on Ibrahim, you see what happens, and you can always clear it here. Or you can still click on just soap. You see so many things changes when you click on soap, and you can clear it here. And you can decide to add more slicers. Remember what I said, you add the slicers here. So you can decide to add maybe a category. Just right click, you can add as many slicers as you want. So that is that about adding slicers. So you can see this, if your design is making more sense, so you can decide also to remove these lines that Excel puts here and do it as a plain sheet, so that this looks beautiful when you present your visualization to the management. So you come to this view at the top here, then you see this grid line here, you uncheck it by clicking on it. So once you do that, you see that all the lines in Excel have already gone out. So you can also decide to come to this your home, then or insert, maybe you don't like this color and you want to pick another different color. So you can actually come and pick a very nice color too, so that maybe you want your work to be exceptional, you're a good designer. So if you come to page layout, you click on colors to show you different colors. So for anyone you touch, you will see that the colors are changing. So you can actually choose any of the fine colors that you feel that portrays your points very well. So let me just pick anyone here. So you see my color have changed, and I can now actually still do the same thing. For anything I touch here, it interacts with this table and this. So this helps you answer any question that anyone will ask you on this data set. So if they ask you the quantity, you can actually use here, come to this here, then check the quantity, right click and bring it out and do your analysis. So the pivot table and the slicers helps you to analyze a range of big data sets without having to go through it manually. So everything on this data set is already on this small sheet. And you can even decide to add a background, maybe to make your work more beautiful. So on this page layout, you click on background. Let's say you have a background photo on your system. So you can actually pick the background you have. I don't think I have anyone here. Well, let me just see whether I have anything saved. Okay, I can just pick this for an example, use a picture and use it as a background. So you see I have a background already than it can do, but I don't need it. So let me just remove it. So this have answered all the questions that we are asked here, and any other question that anyone can ask you from this data set, the pivot table and the slicers have answered the questions. So this is how the slicers work. They interact with the pivot table, and the pivot table interacts with your raw data set. So thank you very much for having watched up to this moment, and I hope that you found this video interesting, educative, and it will help you in your day-to-day financial analysis and overall business success. So if you have any question, you drop it on the comment section, or you send me a direct message and I will answer your questions. Until then, I remain Carlo Chekwas, Street Accountant. It is bye for now.